The sound of suitcase wheels echoed sharply against the marble floor in the grand lobby of the Aurelian Flight Institute, a place where every detail, from the gold-plated door handles to the cascade of crystal lighting, was designed to remind anyone who entered that they were standing among the elite. And in the midst of it all, a woman walked in alone, without a name tag, without insignia, without glory. She wore an old white button-up shirt, its collar wrinkled from too many washes, a pair of faded grey khakis, and flight shoes with scuffed heels. In her hand was a thick notebook with a torn corner and a peeling spine, as if it had survived more storms than anyone else in that room. She didn't say a word, but her presence, too quiet, too real, too out of place, seemed to throw the entire space slightly off balance. A young cadet, slicked back hair, a pristine academy blazer, still stiff from its first pressing, looked her up and down as if inspecting a stain that had dared to land on white tiles. "Looks like janitorial staff are allowed through the main entrance now," he sneered. The group of cadets behind him burst out laughing, sharp and smug. No one defended her. Not one person looked at her as a human being, only as a flaw in their carefully filtered system. But she kept walking, not fast, but never faltering. As she passed the one who mocked her, she paused ever so briefly, just long enough to tighten her grip on the notebook in her hand, as if it was the only thing she'd brought with her, but one that mattered more than all the polished badges gleaming on their chests. She said nothing in return, and it was that silence that made a few people turn their heads, not out of respect, but because something didn't quite fit in the picture they thought was perfect. She walked in quietly, like a breeze straying into a summer ballroom, uninvited, but leaving behind a strange chill that couldn't be ignored. And no one knew. That woman, Ava Langford, would be the one to save their elite flight squad from an aerial explosion just days later, using the very mind they were laughing at now. No one in that room knew that every symbol Ava was jotting down in her worn notebook was a language they had never been taught. Numbers, diagrams, attack angles, manual, aerodynamic recalibrations, all of it outside the scope of any modern curriculum. And that was exactly why it was deemed useless. But to Ava, the notebook wasn't just knowledge, it was memory, it was legacy. Because on those yellowing pages echoed the voice of a man she would never forget. Her father, Aurelian Langford, the test flight legend, once hailed as the last pilot of the previous century who could fly on instinct alone. When she was a child, he didn't tell her fairy tales. He told her about full engine-out landings, about staying calm when every warning light on the panel flashed red. He taught her to fly, with her body's senses, to feel the vibrations in the fuselage, to read the wind's shifting pressure. Things no simulator could capture, but that could save a life in an instant. And he always repeated one thing Ava never forgot: if you can't stand the contempt in their eyes, you don't deserve the cockpit. Because up in the sky, no one has time to ask where you went to school. They only care about one thing: can you get them back to the ground alive? That's why Ava didn't react. She was used to being misjudged, used to the condescending stares, used to the silence, not because she was weak, but because she chose silence to hear more clearly when fate finally called. And the irony was this: while everyone around her was desperately memorizing textbook protocols, Ava was independently reconstructing an entire aerodynamic recovery model based on design failures no one had ever made public. She didn't write to be recognized. She wrote to be ready. And that day, she knew it wasn't far away. While the entire class focused intently on screens filled with digital flight simulations, Ava, seated in the most hidden corner of the room, was taking notes by hand in a faded brown notebook that no one even bothered to glance at. The symbols she scribbled weren't from any textbook, nor from the instructor's lecture, but a precise fusion of classical mechanical aerodynamics and anomalies she had identified in the tail design of the latest Fury T11 model. These formulas were nowhere to be found in modern training programs because they came from a time when her generation, or more accurately, her father's generation, had to keep aircraft alive even after all electronics had failed. Adrian Langford, the man once known to the world as the pilot who flew without instruments, was the pioneer of intuition-based flight at 40,000 feet. He never hugged his daughter when she tripped, but made her learn to read fuselage vibrations when the rudder began to malfunction. He didn't praise her for topping math exams, but scolded her for failing to spot a center of gravity shift on an auxiliary wing blueprint. And he never taught her how to respond to insults. He only taught her how to fly through storms where the thunder roared louder than any criticism. She remembered one evening clearly inside an old hangar on the outskirts of Santa Fe when he placed a firm hand on her shoulder and said in a stern voice, "You need to understand something, Ava. If one day you can stand in a room full of people who look down on you and still hold your breath steady and your silence intact, then you've learned to fly. Because the cockpit isn't for those afraid of how others look at them." And that is why, today, in a classroom filled with students wearing prestigious insignias, she remained silent. She didn't flinch when mocked. She didn't need anyone to speak up for her. Because she wasn't here to be accepted, she was here to listen, observe, take notes, and prepare for what no one in that room believed would happen, a crisis the modern system couldn't solve. And when that moment came, the only thing that would matter was someone who could read the very lines they once laughed at. That noon, the sky above the Western Training Zone burned bright like fire. A squadron of Fury T-11's next-generation super-maneuverable fighter jets took off in a perfect triangle formation, engines roaring like the proud declaration of modern technology. On the ground, officers, cadets, and technical experts looked up with pride, not knowing that just minutes later they would all be frozen still, not by awe of engineering, but by the weight of helplessness. The first warning came as a blinking red signal on the command tower's monitor. Then came the pilot's voice through the radio, taut as a drawn string. "Mayday, Mayday, T-11 Bravo 9, experiencing left yaw failure, no directional response. Aircraft entering uncontrolled spin." A brief, deathly silence. Then radio chaos erupted. Urgent commands were shouted. Emergency maneuver recovery algorithms were entered into the control panel. No response. Flight data scrambled across the screen. The entire system, once thought invincible, had become a jumble of soulless electronic signals. Outside the glass, one Fury began to tilt, lose axis control, spiraling like a steel bird gone mad. Senior officers crowded around the command center, arguing, issuing commands, retracting them. The room was packed with medals and accolades, yet no one knew what to do, because no line in the modern curriculum taught how to handle a total flight control lockout at 700 knots. And in the middle of the chaos, no one noticed a figure rising quietly from her seat, walking through rows of technicians like a silent shadow. Ava Langford didn't run, didn't rush. Her steps carried something that made people pause, without knowing why. She walked up to the emergency microphone, didn't ask for permission, and didn't wait for anyone to yield. With a simple motion, she switched to the internal frequency, picked up the abandoned headset, and spoke with a voice steady and low, not a hint of tremble. "T-11 Bravo 9. Listen to me. Cease all left turn attempts. Lock your right rudder. Reduce throttle by 40%. Disable auto-stabilization. Feel the airframe. Don't fight the torque. Let it go for 1 second, then counteract it manually with your right hand. Don't trust the computer. Trust your senses. Silence rippled out like a shockwave. A senior officer barked, "Who are you? Who gave you permission?" But General Walker, the only one who had stood still the entire time, raised his hand to halt him, eyes fixed on Ava. And then the pilot's voice came through again, trembling but alive, executing, throttle down, auxiliary systems disengaged, switching to manual control. Oh God, nose is leveling out. In a room once filled with laughter and arrogance, now there was only breath tight thin, and the stretch of seconds strung like wire. Outside, the T-11 slowed. Its spin twisted one last time, then held its horizontal axis, wobbling but stable. A stream of rotor blades descended toward the runway wheels, touching down unevenly, smoke rising from burning rubber. But the aircraft held, and it lived. In the control tower, no one spoke. There were no words left. Ava set down the headset as gently as if nothing had happened, as if what just took place was no more than a small routine gesture, then turned and walked out, passing dozens of stunned, speechless, and quietly bowed faces. The shock from the incident hadn't yet settled when an emergency assembly was called. All cadets, officers, and technical supervisors were ordered to report to the main hangar where the Fury T-11 had just landed in an emergency. The scent of burnt rubber, hot metal, and dust still lingered in the air, but the silence was thick, as if the entire Aurelian facility had witnessed something they couldn't bring themselves to name. And then from amidst the rows of frozen seats, General Walker stepped forward, no aide, no cue cards in hand, just holding a thick dossier wrapped in a black leather cover. He raised it up, needing no microphone. "I want every cadet in this room to hear this clearly. This is the file of Ava Langford. I admit, up until 30 minutes ago, I too thought she was just another applicant with missing paperwork or perhaps an administrative mistake." The entire hall held its breath. But when I opened this file, the first thing that caught my eye wasn't her grades or her letters of recommendation. It was a scanned flight test report from the Phantom F-8 team dated April 17th, 2016. The pilot of the only F-8 ever to land safely after full cabin depressurization at 41,000 feet, complete power failure, no GPS, and a free-fall, manually controlled landing over 19 minutes. That pilot was Ava Langford. The room went stiff with silence. He continued, his voice, now deeper, striking straight at the pride of everyone present. She didn't come here to study. She was assigned directly by Graham Hulbrook, the chief sponsor of the Fury program. She was appointed as an emergency tactical advisor, and we should have introduced her from day one. He paused, scanning the crowd. But instead of introducing her, we left her to stand alone in the middle of mocking glances, cruel jokes, and repeated removals from class, and the very people who did that were the ones who couldn't save their squadron when the emergency came. No one spoke. Some cadets lowered their heads. Some officers stood frozen. The one who told her to use the maintenance entrance no longer dared to lift his eyes. The one who had scoffed at her notebook now remembered each line of writing lines they themselves couldn't begin to understand. And Ava, the woman in worn-down shoes, an old shirt, and a notebook that had been mocked, stood at the edge of the hall. She didn't need to step into the center. She didn't need the spotlight. Her face was calm. No triumphant smile. No resentment. Only silence. The same silence that had always accompanied her, but now it echoed like a warning bell for an entire arrogant system. That afternoon, while the Academy was still in a state of shock from the emergency briefing, a new sound swept across the outdoor grounds and brought the entire facility to a standstill, the thumping blades of a helicopter slicing the air above the western hangar. The aircraft was pitch black, bearing no military insignia, no signal lights, only a single identifier code that caused the air traffic staff to fall instantly silent and clear the airspace without a single question. It was the code of Graham Holbrook. He needed no introduction. In the world of aviation, his name carried weight far beyond that of a general. He was the man who had poured hundreds of millions of dollars into next-generation fighter programs, a special advisor to NATO on aerial combat simulation campaigns, and more importantly, the sole financier behind the entire Fury T-11 development initiative that Aurelian was now using for training. The helicopter touched down like a silent warning. 4 bodyguards in black suits opened the door, but the man who stepped out didn't need an escort. He wore a perfectly tailored grey suit, a charcoal tie, slim black sunglasses, and walked slowly, confidently, without a flicker of emotion. Senior officers nearby instinctively stood at attention. Some stiffened in surprise upon seeing him. Others swallowed hard. No one dared approach. No greetings, no pleasantries. He walked straight toward the hangar where the earlier meeting had taken place. The soft click of his polished shoes on the floor sounded almost metallic, each step radiating an invisible pressure that spread through the base. A lieutenant colonel rushed out, hand extended for a handshake, but Holbrook walked past him as if he didn't exist. His gaze stopped on one spot, not the emergency landed aircraft, not the crowd holding its breath, but on the woman standing silently at the edge of the landing zone, still in her worn shirt, scuffed shoes, and holding that same old notebook. Ava looked up at him, saying nothing. There was no look of appeal, no grateful smile, just a small nod between two people who understood each other without needing words. And in that moment, the entire academy understood that the woman they had laughed at was the only person Graham Holbrook had come to see in person. There was no speech, no threats. His presence, his silence was the heaviest warning the world of power could issue. If any of you dare lay another finger on her, you'll answer to me and everything I stand behind. The academy commander rushed over, sweat beading on his forehead, though the sun had long since set. He stood at attention, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. Mr. Holbrook, Ms. Langford has been granted full access to all Aurelian resources. We are fully committed to supporting her in any mission she takes on. Holbrook said nothing. He glanced at Ava one last time, then turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence so heavy no one dared move, no one dared speak. From that day on, no one mocked Ava again. No one dared sneer. Not a single cadet questioned why she had access to any area on base, because they now understood Ava Langford wasn't just a skilled pilot. She was someone the most powerful people quietly stood behind, and that was more fearsome than any rank. There was no speech of commendation, no celebration, no medals awarded. Yet what unfolded after that day became the most silent indictment of the collective arrogance of an academy that had once believed reputation could replace understanding. 1 week after the incident, an emergency simulation exam was held. The topic handling a yaw axis failure with the autopilot system disabled. The exact scenario Ava had resolved using the manual method they once laughed at. The cadets who used to sit in the front row, the ones hailed as undefeated in simulation, failed one by one. Some couldn't even take off without system guidance. One of them was the very young cadet who had once pointed at Ava and said, "You must be in the wrong class yogas down the hall." After each failure, they were required to return to theory labs and relearn from old technical manuals. And among the updated materials was a scanned copy of Ava Langford's notebook, reproduced in its entirety as an official component of the curriculum. Her name was never read aloud, but every page carried her imprint. As for Ava, she didn't teach from a podium. She didn't stand at the front of the room like a victor. Instead, she quietly organized small training sessions for those who truly wanted to learn, not to earn points, but to understand. At first, very few showed up. They were ashamed, embarrassed to be seen. But day by day, the shadows that once laughed behind her back began to appear, standing at the doorway, too hesitant to walk in, then silently taking a seat, opening their notebooks and writing. No one apologized, but the way they lowered their heads, the way they listened intently to every word Ava spoke, the way they stayed silent as she re-explained techniques they once deemed outdated, that was the most sincere apology she had ever received. The officer who once kicked her out of the maintenance zone was suspended after failing to recalibrate a system during a control screen failure. The one who had mocked her for being in the wrong room didn't pass the theoretical exam on manual emergency protocols. And the one who said she was only good for scrubbing aircraft was required by the training board itself to retake emergency handling classes. From Ava, none of them were punished, but they were forced to confront the truth. They had been too arrogant to recognize someone better than themselves simply because she didn't wear the right color uniform. And that lesson, silent, piercing, and inescapable, was what changed them. As for Ava, she never needed to remind them how they had treated her. She let her expertise do it for her, and that was what they feared the most, a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to prove she was right. She only had to stand still and let her knowledge speak for itself. That afternoon, the skies above Aurelian seemed to hold their breath. On the western runway, a formation of Fury T-11s streaked past like thunderbolts, flawless in every banked turn, every synchronized maneuver, but no one's eyes followed the aircraft. They were all fixed on one person, Ava Langford, standing quietly at the runway's edge, not in uniform, without medals, holding only her old notebook and a gaze that seemed to be bidding farewell to a place that once scorned her, then quietly learned from her. There was no farewell ceremony, no applause, but as she turned away, behind her stood a line of cadets and officers, those who once mocked her, now standing still, hands behind their backs, eyes lowered in a wordless apology. The first to step forward was the young officer who had once mocked her, saying she belonged in the cafeteria, not the cockpit. He didn't speak smoothly, couldn't meet her eyes, but he stood tall like a soldier and said, "Miss Langford, we're not worthy, but thank you. And I'm sorry." She nodded, no smile, but her eyes softened as if she forgave them all. Not because they deserved it, but because she understood. For some, learning humility was the greatest leap they would ever make. The next day, Ava left the academy. She left no contact address, took no photos, said no goodbyes. She left the way she had arrived, in silence, needing no validation. But once she was gone, Aurelian was never the same. The technical archive was renamed the Langford Wing. Inside her notebook was hardbound and placed under glass her handwritten notes on manual aerodynamic recovery procedures were added to the official training curriculum. On the control panel of every Fury T-11 training aircraft, a small laser-etched line appeared in the lower left corner. "Stay calm. Fly on. AL." No one publicly stated it was hers, but everyone knew, and no one dared erase it. General Walker, the Academy's former commanding officer, revised the syllabus, requiring all cadets to take a mandatory course on manual analysis of non-electronic emergencies, something that had never existed before Ava. When new cadets were asked who the most inspiring mentor Aurelian had ever known was, they didn't say her name. They simply answered, "The one who taught us that you can save an entire squadron without anyone knowing your name as long as you don't panic, and you know what you're doing." Ava Langford's story isn't a grand heroic tale filled with blazing lights or thunderous applause. It's a quiet, razor-sharp reminder that true brilliance doesn't need to shout, and pride is often the first thing that brings us to our knees. The real lesson isn't in the moment she saved a falling aircraft. It's in the days before that, when she was mocked, dismissed, and treated like a nameless shadow, and still chose to stay. Not because she needed validation, but because she knew her worth didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I believe this: you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to do what's right and do it well, and someday the world will go silent just to hear you speak. And sometimes the person you look down on today might be the only one capable of saving you tomorrow. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't fit into a polished, glamorous world, if you've been told you're not good enough just because you weren't loud, flashy, or the version of success people expected, then this story is for you. Remember, you don't need to be like them. You just need to be you, the calmest, strongest, and most grounded version of yourself. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, where kindness, courage, and true ability rise above bias, then share this video to spread that message. Leave a comment if you've ever been Ava Langford in a room full of doubt. And don't forget to subscribe to Toch Story, where we don't just tell stories. We remind you that dignity, well-timed silence, and belief in yourself can change everything.